Welcome to Finlos Lives. This has been an exciting week for me as it marks the first anniversary of the podcast. One of the most frequent questions that I've received has been, where did I come up with the name? There's a funny story behind that, and it goes back to when I was teaching at Lincoln High School. I had a student in my creative writing class who won an award, and the program which notified him said that he could invite his writing teacher to accompany him to the awards ceremony. And they misspelled my name, and instead of Fialos, they put Finlos. And so it kind of became a running joke in that class that among many of the common mispronunciations, Finlos just stuck. Since then, I have used the name Finlos for various things, whether I'm gaming or posting online on websites or leaving comments. Finlos has just been the handle that I've used. It's close enough to my actual name that it doesn't feel like I'm pretending to be somebody that I'm not, but it also does provide me with a little bit of cover and privacy. As I was thinking about ideas for what would eventually become the podcast, I realized titles and names are really important because it needs to be something that is memorable, something that flows, and something that can be flexible or used in different ways. And so when I was finalizing what would become the various components to the Finlos Lives podcast, that sort of combination of name and verb is what I really, really liked. That I could say, this is the overall brand that I use, Finlos Lives, and then all of the other verb titles, reads, teaches, etc., are subheadings underneath that main I'm living my life sort of title. And I really liked it. And so that's just where I've gone with it. Podcasting is something that I've wanted to do for a long time and for different reasons. My training is, my undergraduate degree, I should say, is in creative writing, and I've always thought of myself as a writer. If not in practice, at least in terms of identity. I taught creative writing for many years, and it has always been one of my passions. I don't have great practices, though. I have really bad habits when it comes to my own writing practice. And I've always considered how I might be able to embed a creative process into my daily routine in a way that would help me to be productive, in a way that didn't feel like a chore, in a way that actually produced results that I was happy with and that I feel represent who I am. And so I have always had an interest in audio and recording. I've played instruments. I love technology. And so podcasting just seemed like a great fit. And it's something, again, that I've wanted to do for a really long time as a hobby. And finally, with the pandemic and certain other situations in life sort of lining up, I finally had the time and the space and the opportunity to do it. It also became, and still is, a very important aspect of my therapeutic process and maintaining my mental health. Writing, as most writers will tell you, is an excellent way of processing and coming to terms with the difficulties that we all face in our daily life. But because I don't enjoy journaling, or because I'm not as, I'm not as diligent with my writing practice, this is a much more practical way of me being able to regularly express the feelings and the ideas that I'm having in a way that allows me to be creative, but does not put up the barriers or does not include the barriers that often get in the way of me actually following through with my goals. And in that way, podcasting has become an important outlet for me, a way of me being able to put my ideas, instead of on paper, on a recording. And so, in addition to that, Finlos Lives also began as a way for me to share interests. I'm a huge nerd, as anybody who knows me can attest. And if we go all the way back to the beginning of this show, my first 3 episodes were about the book Dune. And it was a good timing because it was just at the time when the Denis Villeneuve Dune movie was released. And so I think that was the final impetus for me really putting this show together. I really wanted to be able to share my love for those novels, to discuss many of sort of the intricacies that I think that most people might miss on a first watch, or if they've never read the books. And so I guess it became a good way for me to cut my teeth on this whole process. Back then, a year ago, I was scripting everything, which added, it actually put those barriers in place, because taking the time to have to write things out is a hard task for me to do. Not because I don't enjoy it, but because time is finite, and, or at least as we experience it in our daily lives, we don't have all the time in the world to sit and write a script for a podcast. But since then, I have become more adept at outlining as opposed to scripting things, and having a much more natural and fluid process. Or at least I hope it sounds more natural. But after those first 3 episodes, I kind of felt limited by that format, by the scripted format. And based upon the feedback that I was hearing from the handful of listeners that I had, I quickly found that there were other ideas that I really wanted to explore and develop. And so I also came to realize that there was a lot I needed to learn about this creative endeavor. Because while we might try to simplify our tasks in any realm, there's always going to be a learning process, and there's always going to be things that we have to perfect in order to get things to a state that we are happy with. And this is also hard for me, because I have a tendency to want to produce finished products. So this goes all the way back to when I was in school, where I'd have an essay due, and as a writing instructor and as a teacher, I know that the data and I know that the results indicate that drafting and revising and taking feedback into account and editing and then going through that whole cyclical writing process is important. And I tend not to do that. I tend to want to have all of the pieces in place before I begin, so that I do things once, or that at least on that first try, things are mostly in place, so that any sort of editing or revising that I have to do is limited. Because I don't like redoing things. I don't like the idea of having to break things apart and put them back together in a different way. So I take a lot of time in preparing to do things. And so as I'm thinking about how I came to podcasting, I realized that I'd actually been working on various versions of what this show would become for about a year before I even began that first episode. There were videos that I was making of myself writing things and then recording them and then posting those things to YouTube, or me just making little audio recordings of stuff as I was going through a given day and just talking about things. And I shared some of that with people, but that was really nothing like what I am doing now with this show. And when I look back, I realized that I was iterating and that I was sort of developing the structure for how I wanted things to be the types of content that I wanted to share. And in order to streamline the actual task of recording, so that the work that I do beforehand results in a more finished product, so that the editing and revision can be easier and more straightforward, and also generally so that my final product just sounds more professional and is more enjoyable to listen to, because I have listened to some fairly unrefined and amateurish sounding podcasts, and that's not to diminish the content, because I think that just like writing or any other creative endeavor, this is an act of vulnerability and an act of sharing, as any person puts their voice to record and then to share. But in terms of the quality and the structuring and the thought process, I can tell when I'm listening to something that is not fully formed. And so I have always wanted to avoid that as much as possible in order to produce a quality product, because ultimately, in a non-economic sense and just a sort of partaking of a piece of content, it is a product, and I want it to be a product that people enjoy as they consume it, as they listen to it. And I have grown a lot since I started this. I already spoke to how I no longer script things out. As I'm recording this, I have a pretty detailed outline that takes me some time to create, but I am much more confident in my ability to speak and to create coherent thoughts and sentences, and it is a conscious effort to moderate my voice and to speak without the sort of verbal tics that most of us have, the ums and the uhs, and they're still there. Some of them get edited, but I do leave some of them because they're natural. But it is all a process, and it is one that I have really enjoyed over the past year, developing and iterating upon. And I intend to keep doing it into the foreseeable future. I'm really proud of the show and the stories and topics that I've been able to put together, how the styles of the episodes have diversified, and how the various lives, loves, asks, teaches, reads episodes, they all still manage to fit under that larger idea of my life, Finlos Lives, that sort of personal podcast. I'm really proud of that. And I have sometimes wondered if these things should each have their own sort of show, or if having so many different titles sort of waters down the overall impact. And I don't think so, but I also don't think it really matters, because ultimately I'm producing things that I would want to hear, and the labels, I think, are there to help potential listeners decide what they're interested in. So that's my thinking behind that. But as I'm looking back, what I think I'm most proud of are the interviews and conversations that I've been able to have, specifically the Finlos Asks and the Finlos Loves episodes with my partner, Eva. Those two programs in particular are just, they bring me so much joy, because they put me in conversation with people who are some of the most important folks in my life, some of the people who have impacted me the most, and who I think their stories are just amazing and complex and have so much to offer. I'm so thankful for the opportunity to speak to the people that I have, and I hope to continue to do so for until the distant future, because I think that those are valuable. I think the whole intent of this show is to share and to build community. The other thing that I really enjoy, in addition to having the conversations, but this was the most surprising thing to me, is that once the recording is done, I really enjoy diving into the editing process. And I've become quite meticulous in how I listen to and edit and modify the audio that I record, And to those who are curious, I do not alter the content. I do not alter the order in which things are said. I don't change messaging or any of that sort of thing. Mostly what I'm doing is streamlining. I erase empty spaces where I think that it's awkward. I erase a lot of verbal tics, the ums and the uhs and the ands and those sort of things. I try to create warmth, and I don't do that by editing people's voices. I don't use much processing of the audio because I want people to hear people as they sound. So that process of snipping a little fraction of a second here, or tweaking this breath there, or just ensuring that the conversation feels alive and feels natural, I love doing that, and helping to turn a conversation into a story, I think, is probably my favorite part of the editing process. And of course, cutting myself out as much as possible. It is my goal when I'm recording a person for one of those shows is to pose questions that allow the person to speak as much as possible. And in anything that I ask further, or any prompts that I ask or that I provide, are intended to deepen the conversation and to provide more context. I don't want to be the dominant force of those conversations because, in my mind, I don't want to listen to myself. I'm here for that guest. I've also learned a lot about how to use the technology, specifically the microphones, and microphone technique is super important. And I'm not perfect, and I mess up a lot. But that has been one of the more interesting and fun aspects of learning how to do this podcast, is how to work with the technology to ensure that I am getting the best content in its raw form from the very beginning, so that way the final product is the best that it can be. And all that brings me to why I think I'm doing this in the first place. And not to sound selfish, but I do it for me. I am the first listener, and I am my harshest critic. And I view this podcast as an act of sharing and as an opening for connection with people. I produce the podcast for an expanded audience, of course. After a year, I can say that the audience is still small, but it is consistent. And I am humbled by people's willingness to allow these little creative ventures into their daily routines. I always encourage feedback from people who listen, and I love questions and I love comments. But even if no one was listening, even if it was just me, I would still be doing it because this is my journal. And that's why I'm doing this. So thank you so much for this first year of Finlos Lives. I am going to continue to do it for the foreseeable future. It is my way of practicing good mental hygiene. It is a way for me to connect with people and to produce my own little history, my own little account of this tiny little space in the world that I exist in. And I'm so happy to be here. And now for what we've been watching. We recently finished Star Wars Andor, and I think that it is the best long-form Star Wars program that Disney and Lucasfilm have produced to date. I know that I am not the only one to have this opinion, but I do think it is worth exploring some of the reasons why I think this particular show is so good. Full disclosure, I am a lifelong Star Wars fan, and while I don't think that everything that has been produced in the Star Wars universe is great, I generally enjoy the setting and the stories within it. A regular complaint that has come up since the films and shows started being released after the Disney purchase of Lucasfilm is a general lack of creativity or willingness to move outside the time frame of the original trilogy or characters related to those films. Both the prequel and sequel trilogies tell the stories of the Skywalker family, and the Star Wars story films, Rogue One and Solo, are prequels to A New Hope and flesh out characters and backstories for elements of the original trilogy. And so far, the shows on Disney Plus, The Mandalorian and The Book of Boba Fett, are filling in story elements between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens, while Obi-Wan is telling the story between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope. And now Andor, the most recent show to release on the streaming platform, is a prequel to Rogue One, another prequel, this one fleshing out the character Cassian Andor's backstory. Just considering this assortment of titles, the complaint starts to hold water. There are thousands of years of already constructed history, some canon, some belonging to the pre-Disney expanded universe, with which writers could mine for story elements or ideas. There have been novels and comics that explore new territory, but those tend to be more niche and limited in their reach. Accepting this limitation, then, it is sensible to approach Andor with limited expectations regarding new elements. After all, if you've seen Rogue One, then you know where this all ends up. And yet, Rogue One director and Andor creator, writer, and executive producer Tony Gilroy, along with his writers and teams of episode directors, have managed to produce the most compelling piece of Star Wars media. That is tough to say when I consider that Season 1 of The Mandalorian gave us Din Djarin and Grogu, and just this year we were able to watch the Obi-Wan series. And as a footnote, I'm including The Book of Boba Fett as a sub-series of The Mandalorian. And while these series have given us maybe some of the highest highs in Star Wars lore, no other show is as consistent in its character development, maturity of narrative, quality of production and acting, and overall sense of scope. It feels simultaneously like the least Star Wars story to date, but the most grounded in the Star Wars universe. I think key to this success is the show's willingness to trust itself to tell a compelling story without leaning too heavily on fan service, arcane references, character name drops and cameos, or Jedi and lightsabers. Those elements are all there, or at least potentially all there, but they are only constituent elements that combine with solid dialogue, action with stakes, and drama that moves to draw in and hold the audience. And because it doesn't talk down to its audience or simplify its story, the show's creators have managed to build a lived-in world with genuinely likable and unlikable characters, conflicts that feel meaningful, and a story that parallels our world's politics without being blunt or preachy. To quantify this with specifics that don't reveal the main plot, the first episode drops us on a dark and seedy world with our main character in a brothel, where he is seeking information about his missing sister from the establishment's sex workers. Their willingness to speak to him while seemingly skipping over other patrons is enough to incite a moment of violence that feels all too unnecessary, casual, and real. And it's Cassian Andor's dealing with the consequences of this encounter that starts the cascade that is the rest of the season's 12 episodes. Diego Luna, who reprises his role as Cassian Andor, never fails to deliver a truthful, grounded performance, and the series begins to fill in the shell of the mostly completed character that we find in Rogue One. He is complex, rash in his thinking and action, but dauntless in his willingness to see things through. Andor also sets itself apart from the other Disney Plus Star Wars programming in that was largely filmed on location rather than with a mix of sets and the digital soundstage known as the volume. This too provides a sense of space and weight to the worlds we see throughout the show, even in those rare moments when most of what we see is digitally constructed. Again, I'm a fan of the programming that Disney has been releasing for Star Wars, but there have been moments when those shows felt small or cheap, which are not descriptions I generally associate with Star Wars. While I prefer the long-form structure of programs that has become the norm thanks to streaming platforms, the limitations of television production do sometimes show. Andor, thankfully, has found the best balance between the limitations of budget and production on the small screen versus what we might see for a theatrical release. We are thankfully getting a second and final season of the show, and Disney does not intend to run the series into the ground, though some reporting states that an initial pitch had plans for 5 years worth of content. Apparently, Diego Luna would not make such a long commitment to the project, and Gilroy reworked the story into a second season with several story arcs, each covering a year of time, all culminating with the story of Rogue One. I agree with the criticism that Disney can and should open up the Star Wars universe at other times in its history, but Andor is going a long way to at least make the rebellion that we grew up rooting for actually be complex, messy, but ultimately worthy. The second season of Andor is currently filming and will likely be released in the fall of 2024. That's it for this episode. If you have comments, questions, or suggestions for future episodes, please contact me via social media, email me at finloslives@gmail.com, or leave me a voice message via the SpeakPipe app at finloslives.com. If you would like to become a financial supporter of the show, you can do so at the Finlos Lives page on Patreon. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to our next conversation.